Good morning. This is DebraVWilson. It is Friday, the 7th of August, 2020. This podcast is entitled Observing Privilege Whilst Traveling. Over 30 years ago, I started traveling internationally, with the exception of two trips. The first one being a trip I made with my mother, may she rest in peace, Mrs. Wilson, to Paris, and then to a trip I made with my late partner, Mr. Arthur Smeester. May he rest in peace. He traveled with me to London, England. With those two exceptions, I've always traveled by myself. So my maiden voyage across the pond, the Atlantic, was from Chicago. At that time, I lived in Chicago, to London, England. I'm in my early 60s. This is over 30 years ago. I was in my 20s. I traveled by myself, again, alone, and so of course, I knew the mechanism of traveling. I was on a British Airways flight, BA296, across the pond. But I didn't understand the myriad of dynamics that happened within self when you left what is yours, what was yours, in my case, what it was my home, my place of being. I didn't realize that often when you do that, you bring all your stuff with you. So I started traveling to London, going back and forth, quickly got volunteer jobs, and immersed myself in the cultures of London, not realizing or understanding that I'd brought my own belief systems with me. So one of the things I brought with me, because we're talking over 30 years ago, was the way in which hierarchies around identity are constructed, were, and to some extent still are constructed in Chicago. I was born, baptized, and raised Catholic, and I was a practicing Catholic for many, many years. I still am culturally Catholic, and at this point in my life, I'm making the journey of conversion to Judaism. So I'm giving you all this stuff about myself so you can contextualize. I remember when I was making more frequent trips to London, and that was 3 to 4 times a year, that I needed to build a life here because I was in London so often, and that included going to a place of worship. So I needed to find a church. I remember walking around and asking people for if they knew where a Catholic church was. I mean, that's what you do in Chicago. I remember not always getting the best of receptions, and I remember finally being in a place, one of the London tourist boards in central London, and asking for asking for information on a church, and being given information on churches, and the names just didn't sound quote unquote right to me. And I remember asking, "Is that a Catholic church?" And I remember the woman snapped at me and said, "No, we don't list Catholic churches." So there was a woman in the queue behind me who came forward, who was of Irish ancestry. She was Irish. I could tell by the accent. And she said, "My dear, are you Catholic?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "They don't like us very much." And she told me where I could go to Catholic church in central London. Of course, she told me Westminster Cathedral. And then I eventually found St. Joe's in Highgate Hill. It was quite the journey for me to understand that the hierarchy around identity, assigned meaning, because these narratives are created around identities, wasn't stagnant, that it moved and shifted from country to country. So I didn't understand the animus between that often I encountered from British people from English people toward Irish people. and in some cases vice versa. For instance, the church in Highgate Hill, St. Joe's, the Irish people there and the congregation at that time, well, the service I went to, the morning service on Sunday, was overwhelmingly Irish. Irish nationals who had immigrated to the UK, or Irish of Irish descent. And so I could not understand what this was about. I knew about the Troubles. I understood that. But what I did not understand was that there was a differentiation in whiteness. And I'm going to keep it focused on London, because in Chicago, although it was and is highly segregated, and everybody's myriad of identities, you sort of wear them on your sleeve, and everybody, if you don't acknowledge them, somebody else will. So it's so blatant in Chicago, but nevertheless, white is white. Dare I say, white is in quotes right. And when I looked at Irish people, the vast majority of them, the ones certainly that I met at St. Joe's, and the English, they were all white people. And so I didn't get it. And I literally said to someone, a taxi driver, a Nigerian taxi driver I had one time, and he was talking to me, and he said, I told him I was from Chicago. He knew about the racism in Chicago and the racial stratification and the hierarchy in Chicago. And he said, there's racism in London, but he said he thought the greatest amount of strife at this particular time was between those of Irish identity and the English. And he said it must be confusing for you. And like it was yesterday, I remember saying with great embarrassment, now looking at it, but I remember saying, I don't get it. They're all white people. There came a point in my life that I did get it. More about that later. In any case, I continued my travels back and forth to London, England. I ended up traveling through many parts of Western Europe. I've also traveled to and lived in Canada, and I've traveled to, and for a short period of time, I lived in Israel. After the journey of traveling and traveling to and living in London, and in addition, traveling to and living in Ireland, I lived in Dundalk, which had an IRA presence for a time. And I got to understand the difference that all white skin isn't white skin, and all white people. I know it must sound terrible and terribly. It just sounds like an unintelligent thing to say, and to say it now, it's absolutely embarrassing to me. But I'm from Chicago. My parents were part of the Great Migration from Mississippi. They lived through Jim Crow. And I looked at white skin as white people. And so the experiences in London, and then living in Dublin for a time, Greater Dublin, and then going on to live in Dundalk because of an engagement, I understood that all white wasn't always white the way it's constructed in Chicago. I also began to get a stronger sense of, and by the way, I was in Dundalk in the 90s. I began to get a stronger sense of what factors that can assign meaning to the biological manifestations, our skin color, our tone, our hair texture, right? And then there's those other things that are environmental, like the accent, the languages we speak, where we emerge from. And so because of Dundalk and the myriad of people there that I met, some people who I believe were IRA members, although when I asked, they all said no. some people who were politicians, uh, and some people who were in the guard of the police. It gave me this perspective on Irishness. And then, of course, when I was in Dublin, there were people who did not have either political or, dare I say, militarized identities. And it's an Irish country, a majority white-skinned Irish country, and still how they constructed themselves in juxtaposition to the British was very different than the dominant culture in Chicago being Irish American who are Catholic. So because you have to be a thinking person. So that's the whole point of living, is to learn and contribute from what you learn. And so the understanding that our identities, those constructs, what it means, is, and how that meaning is assigned to the biological manifestations of ourselves, right? Because we look a certain way because of our genetic makeup, then countries all over the world assign meaning, and the people in those countries assign meaning, and that's based on sociological reasons, historical reasons, political reasons, and so many other reasons. So I'm jumping around, but that's sort of the way I do these things in my podcast. So I'm going to jump ahead. And when I was in Canada, Canada is next door, is north of the U.S. Even I know that, and I don't have a sense of direction. And it was interesting for me because I started traveling to Canada in my 50s. So I'd already had the being knocked about, and metaphorically speaking, in London, and with my misunderstandings of the importance of understanding narratives that have been created, and the politics by the hierarchical ordering of people. For instance, I thought I would have automatic kinship with Afro-Caribbeans and West Africans in London because we were all black people. Yeah, that didn't work out either. And as a matter of fact, a group of Afro-Caribbean feminists told me when they asked me to exit their group was that we may all be black, sister, but you're an American. So by the time I went to Canada, I had that experience. I had the experience in Dundalk and in Dublin, and the myriad of other travel experiences I've had. But nevertheless, when I went to Canada for the first time, when I traveled in my 50s, I remember thinking, well, it can't be that much different than America. Yeah, I still didn't learn. So I again began to think and believe, although this time at least I knew I shouldn't broadcast it loudly. I began to believe that society was probably organized in much the same way that it was in Chicago and in America, although at that time I no longer lived in Chicago. It wasn't. And I learned about the tragic, painful journey of the indigenous peoples of Canada, Turtle Island. And it was again a learning experience for me. So now I'm going to move to the next space. Israel. I've been doing quite a bit of moving around in the last 10 years. So, this is not that podcast, but I've moved around, and I went to Israel where I stayed in 2017 for 3 months, I think over 3 months. And if you see my photograph, I'm black, and I don't speak either Hebrew or Arabic, unfortunately. And I have an American accent, although it's a tad bit muddled. these days. I also identified as Muslim at that time, publicly identified as Muslim, and had a great deal of concern and trepidation about traveling to Israel. Although some Jewish friends had invited me there, nevertheless, I had all this trepidation. But in any case, at least this time, I was going to a country that I thought needed to address its relationship with the Palestinians. I thought I had a firm grasp on the hierarchies in both Israel and the Palestinian territories. I knew about Black people in Israel, Ethiopians, Black Jews, and the asylum seekers. But nobody told me about the Russian Jews. Nobody told me that. And so it was interesting that some of the most, can I say racist? I don't know what the word is. Some of the most racist comments I heard, indeed, the most prevalent racist comments I heard in Israel were from Ashkenazi Jews about Russian Jews. So no one mentioned that. And I did my shopping, the part of Haifa I was in, I did my shopping in a Russian grocery store. And it was the Russian Jewish community that I found a great deal of comfort in and camaraderie. And that was also interesting to me because that's not the group I thought. First of all, I just had very little awareness of the group. My affinity group would have been definitely the feminist community that I reached out to, and thank God they reached back. But so that's definitely was my political affinity, but my day-to-day life and the community in which I lived briefly, that I saw and where I did my grocery shopping, and where when I went out walking, the people I talked to were Russian Jews, immigrants to Israel. So this is another one of these messy podcasts I've done. Messy, but I hope it at the very least holds some interest for one or two of my listeners. But all along the way, as I did when I first made my maiden voyage across the pond to London, even if it's been a painful journey of learning, I've always tried to learn. And so now, in my early 60s, I say with a smile and such passion, this seeking to understand how and why societies organize themselves in the hierarchical manner they do, to me is nothing short of amazing. Amazing. It's these hierarchies are often painful, definitely for people at the bottom. And I still seek to understand what happened, when it happened, and to understand. Also, I'd like to say the other interesting thing. So here's the thing. I have friends that may not necessarily be friends with each other. But one of the more fascinating things about travel and hierarchies and identities would be how they respond to your set of identities. I'm a Black woman who was firmly ensconced in my American identity, but I became too international, I'm saying it in quotes, for parts of the U.S. government, and I became a person non grata. a non-person in the U.S. I was literally told by the U.S. government, an agency, a policing agency in the U.S. government, that I was a threat to America because I knew too many foreigners. So it's been interesting to see as my identity shifts, as I lose one, and which is definitely the belief that I would always be an American, and I'm not sure about that these days, and I haven't been for a while. But it's also interesting as I've moved through the world and made friends with people of, at times, conflicting and